My name is Avon Kalia, and I was 34 when Serial's message lit up my phone screen in the dead of dawn. There were no pleasantries, no asking how the logistics firm was running. It was an order, cold and sterile. I had covered the equity line on that sprawling estate 96 consecutive times. Yet when I accidentally glanced at their final trust ledger, my name existed nowhere. I found those pages by pure chance in a binder they told me to sort. I stared at the ink, looked away, stared again. Then I locked myself in my sedan for an entire hour, staring at the steering wheel. Nobody anticipated my next move. Welcome back to Silent Reckonings, the space where we listen to daughters who finally stopped justifying their existence and let raw reality speak instead. If you crave tales of quiet boundaries and methodical payback, pull up a chair, drop a comment with your city, and hit subscribe. Serial's early demand was hardly an anomaly. Over nearly a decade, my caller ID told a familiar story. Whenever that landline flashed, a fresh invoice followed, a cracked foundation, an overdue premium, a property tax hike. I operate a boutique supply chain consultancy out of a loft in Oak Haven, roughly 40 miles from my childhood driveway. I grew that consultancy from a single contract to a massive portfolio. My entire livelihood revolves around balancing ledgers to the exact cent. I sleep beautifully at night. They raised me to fix things, and I excelled at it. But competence slowly mutated into a life sentence of obligation. That sprawling estate eats up 4 acres of land in a township so tiny, gossip travels faster than weather. I lived in my own purchased high-rise by then, far enough to exhale freely, but close enough that I still rushed over the second panic struck. And I always rushed. My younger sibling, Kaylin, occupied a rental flat in the opposite direction. Funny how geographic distance shielded him from the crises that constantly bombarded my inbox. If the HVAC system collapsed, my phone rang. If Kaylin's transmission blew, my phone rang. I justified it. I convinced myself this was simply the duty of a capable daughter. I spun a lot of fairy tales in my head over those 8 years. The reality? I never bothered to ask how they valued my existence behind closed doors. I really should have investigated sooner. Because the dawn Serial fired off that text, an ugly suspicion already lived in my gut. I just wasn't prepared for the emotional toll of finally slicing the cord.
To make sense of that morning, we need to rewind 8 years to the freezing November when they almost lost the estate. Thane, my father, walked away from his engineering career early after his knees gave out completely. Serial never held a corporate job. They had pulled equity from the property twice during a booming market, spending cash like water. The interest rates eventually spiked, draining their pathetic savings. I was barely 26. A certified letter arrived on a Tuesday. Serial read the bank's eviction warning to me, her voice trembling like a confused child reciting a foreign language. I sped over there past midnight. The 3 of us huddled around the mahogany dining table, staring at the disaster. Saving the acreage meant securing a drastic consolidation loan, but no financial institution touches 2 jobless seniors drowning in bad credit. They needed a guarantor with spotless history and a thriving company. They needed my signature. So I grabbed the pen. However, the escrow officer refused to let me gamble my entire future blindly. He warned me about the trap of bleeding heart children sacrificing themselves. He forced a brutal restructuring to shield my assets. That afternoon, Thane and Serial signed a revised property deed, transferring 65% ownership directly to me.
I provided the capital to erase their arrears and absorbed the debt entirely in my name. I left that office as the principal debtor and the undisputed majority owner. The stark percentages stared back at us from the legal parchment. Thane dismissed it as mere bureaucracy.
Sariel wept and called it a miracle. I just saw it as preventing them from sleeping on the pavement. I locked that escrow file inside a steel safe. That exact paperwork would eventually dictate our entire reality. From that Tuesday onward, the financial burden shifted to my shoulders. Every single month, a brutal transfer auto-drafted from my corporate account. I absorbed the skyrocketing property levies. I replaced the shattered plumbing in year 3 and overhauled the entire electrical grid in year 6. I hid nothing. I slammed the invoices down in front of Sariel, who would blindly pat my wrist and praise my loyalty. Meanwhile, Kaylin dominated every holiday conversation. Kaylin was just a misunderstood artist. Kaylin was discovering his true path. Kaylin abandoned his latest gig, and Thane fiercely defended him, claiming the boy simply lacked proper mentorship. Whenever Kaylin fell behind on his lease, Sariel begged me for cash. Suddenly, my direct transfers to his landlord were labeled as loans to the parents. As a logistics expert, spotting anomalies is my literal profession. I tracked the absurd flow of money. I would casually broach the topic during Thanksgiving. I suggested Kaylin might finally carry his own weight. Sariel would immediately adopt the posture of a wounded animal, aggressively redirecting the chatter to the roast turkey. Thane would scoff, loudly declaring that true bloodlines don't keep tabs. I bit my tongue repeatedly. Pushing back meant initiating World War III, and since that massive loan stained my personal credit profile, abandoning them meant detonating my own financial stability. So I played the stoic anchor. I tricked myself into believing anchor was a badge of honor. It took nearly a decade to realize it was unpaid labor, and nobody bothered to inform me of the terms. Then came April. Thane's chest seized up. It happened on a muggy Sunday while he was pruning the blackberry bushes. Sariel dialed my number before she even thought to contact the paramedics. It was a glaring indicator of the twisted hierarchy under that roof. I shattered speed limits, arriving just behind the siren. He survived the surgical stint. After 4 days in the ICU, a mountain of post-op instructions piled up. Nobody else intended to glance at those pages. So I stepped up.
I always stepped up. I organized his aggressive medication schedule into color-coded pill boxes. I interrogated the surgical team, mastering the lethal distinctions between coagulation modifiers and basic aspirin. That terrifying brush with the grave flipped a switch in their heads. Suddenly, establishing a rock-solid estate plan became an absolute obsession. They ditched the cheap online templates and hired a premium local firm. Sariel shoved a massive canvas tote filled with folders at my chest, commanding me to audit the chaos because I was the detail-oriented child. I slumped at my kitchen island that evening, pouring a stiff glass of whiskey to endure the task. I waded through crusty tax returns, expired insurance policies, and the property deed I knew backward and forward. Then my fingers brushed against a crisp, heavy stock envelope buried at the absolute bottom. The firm's embossed logo sat in the corner. The adhesive flap gaped open, totally unsealed. My gut screamed at me to shove it back in the tote. I knew exactly what lived inside that envelope, and I knew looking at the ink would permanently destroy whatever fragile delusion I still carried about my place in that family. I told myself to walk away.
But I slid the heavy parchment out anyway. My entire life was built on verifying data. I had never regretted investigating the truth until that exact second. It was a freshly minted trust document, notarized a mere 14 days after Thane was discharged from the cardiac ward. I scanned the legal clauses exactly how I audit a corrupted supply chain ledger, hunting for my own identity. I was a ghost. The sprawling acreage, the vintage restored Bronco, the emergency bonds I single-handedly replenished, Sariel's heirloom sapphires. Every single asset was bequeathed unconditionally to the male heir. Kaylin. I merited exactly one line of text. The attorneys had typed that the daughter had already extracted sufficient value during the grantor's lifetimes and was therefore permanently excluded from the distribution. Sufficient value. I had funded 96 brutal property cycles, and my reward was a clinical sentence declaring I was too greedy to deserve a dime. I read the paragraph a second time. Logisticians always verify the data. The data was flawlessly cruel. They had drafted this exclusion while I was aggressively fighting insurance reps for his post-op care, while I was draining $4,000 to settle a zoning fine so the municipality wouldn't seize their driveway. I didn't shed a tear. Society assumes the neglected daughter will break down weeping, but my eyes remained totally dry. Instead, an icy realignment happened in my chest. A silent, irreversible click. It felt exactly like isolating a catastrophic mathematical error after hunting it for days. I slid the trust back into the unsealed envelope. I arranged the tote bag with sickening perfection, just as ordered, and dumped the remainder of my $80 whiskey down the drain. I needed my mind razor sharp for what was coming. I showed up for Sunday supper the following weekend. I kept my mouth shut about the estate. I needed to study the dynamics of the room first, analyzing the variables before executing a maneuver. Sariel had prepared her signature braised lamb. Kaylin sat across from me with Lyrene, a woman who had recently transitioned from casual girlfriend to fiancée, and judging by her sudden dietary restrictions, something far more permanent. As predictable as the sunset, the chatter steered towards the estate's destiny. Kaylin casually announced that he and Lyrene were considering relocating to the main house to monitor Thane's recovery. Sariel beamed as if he had just cured a disease. Thane, slicing the meat with steady hands, declared it was brilliant strategy to secure the territory for the male bloodline. I kept my voice dead level and asked him to clarify his definition of territory. He didn't even pause his knife. The land anchors the sun. It's the natural order, he stated, like he was reciting the boiling point of water.
Sariel hummed her agreement, passing the roasted carrots. Kaylin stared down at his china plate, sporting the suppressed smirk of a man who just won the lottery without buying a ticket. Not a single soul at that mahogany table suspected I had decoded the trust. They felt zero obligation to brief me on their succession plans, because in their twisted narrative, I wasn't a family member. I was an ATM, and you don't invite the ATM to the reading of the will. I politely asked Thane about his upcoming EKG results. I navigated the 40 miles back to my high-rise, gripping the leather steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white, playing that one phrase on a torturous loop. The land anchors the sun. I had bled my own accounts dry for 8 years to secure that land. I had essentially been funding my own disinheritance. That evening, I locked myself in the home office I bought with my own sweat. I approached the betrayal the only way I knew how. I booted up my dual monitors and opened a blank financial matrix. I cataloged roughly 3,000 days of extraction: the principal, the interest, the catastrophic repairs, the property levies, Kaylin's misplaced rent checks that I had quietly absorbed.
The final aggregate slammed into the six-figure stratosphere. In the adjacent column, I logged the reciprocation I was promised. That column remained completely void. Nobody had ever offered a guarantee. They just projected an expectation, and I was the fool who swallowed it. I am not prone to theatrics. I had no intention of drafting a dramatic manifesto or screaming in their foyer about emotional neglect. They would simply label me a hysterical, ungrateful child. So I executed the single most devastating action a solvent, independent woman can take. I logged into my corporate banking portal. I navigated to the automated clearinghouse profile I had established nearly a decade ago, the one that dutifully bled me on the first of every month. I hovered my cursor over the active status. Then I clicked Terminate. No hostile emails, no final warnings. Just an absolute void where their financial life support used to be. I discovered that night that silence possesses a deafening volume when a household survives purely on your charity. It would take precisely one billing window for the system to crash, and it would demand every ounce of my willpower not to reactivate the transfer out of sheer, pathetic muscle memory. The initial 72 hours were agonizing.
My thumb phantom swiped toward the banking app constantly. You don't instantly erase a decade of financial subjugation. But I held the line. I drove to the logistics firm. I balanced client portfolios, ate cold salads at my monitor, and dialed Thane to ask about his sodium intake, uttering absolutely nothing regarding capital. The first of the month dawned and vanished. By the fourth, the lender's automated server shot a delinquency alert to my phone. Because the debt carried my signature, the warning came to me. I stared at the bold red text, then flipped the screen downward. Mastering the art of intentional inaction requires brutal discipline, especially when your entire identity is wired to be the savior. My nervous system screamed at me to wire the funds. I brewed a bitter espresso instead. I chanted a brutal reality check until the tremors in my hands subsided. I did not create this emergency. The invoice has simply arrived at its rightful destination. By the 8th day, a secondary default notice pinged. Absolute radio silence from the acreage. They either remained oblivious, or they were holding their breath, waiting for my automatic rescue. I knew the truth. I had played the designated rescuer for my entire adult life. Their silence wasn't ignorance, it was a lit fuse. On the 11th, Serial finally called.
No greetings. It mirrored the text she would send weeks later. She sounded breathless, claiming some clerical idiot at the lender had harassed them over a missing deposit, insisting my portal must be glitching. My tone dropped to absolute zero. I told her there was no glitch. I stated I had severed the automatic routing. The dead air stretching across the cellular connection was suffocating. Then the waterworks triggered, right on cue, exactly as they always did when her control slipped. She sobbed that she couldn't comprehend my cruelty. She weaponized the word loyalty, crying that our bloodline was supposed to protect its own. She wailed that I was her unbreakable pillar and accused me of losing my mind. I let her finish. Then I softly asked if Thane's finalized trust was designed to protect the bloodline too. Another heavy, paralyzed silence. She pivoted with terrifying speed. She snapped that the estate documentation was Thane's exclusive domain and utterly irrelevant to the debt. Real families don't keep tallies, she hissed, delivering it like a fatal strike. The hypocrisy was so blinding I almost chuckled. Tallying ledgers is how I literally survive. For almost a decade, I was the sole resident of that family who hadn't kept a scorecard. I just blindly financed their lives. I didn't fire back. Screaming was her battlefield, not mine.
I told Serial I loved her, promised we would speak soon, and killed the connection before she could drag me into the emotional mud wrestling she always won. She dialed my number twice more that evening. I watched the screen glow and fade, letting the voicemails pile up. Then I grabbed a pen and documented the exact date and time in my ledger. Some habits keep you sane. Kalen entered the battlefield on day 12, an absolute land speed record for him. He fired off a text first, and when I didn't instantly reply, he actually called. His tone carried that greasy, unearned confidence of a man who never had to balance a checkbook or sweat over a utility shutoff. "Mom is entirely shattered," he accused. "What exactly is your malfunction? Are you actively trying to trigger another cardiac episode for Dad?" Notice how he played the heart condition immediately. It was his ultimate trump card. I replied, my voice dead flat, that I was intimately acquainted with Thane's cardiovascular health, seeing as I personally archived his discharge summaries and managed his pharmacy authorizations. Kalen ignored the facts entirely. He pivoted to a speech he had clearly rehearsed in the mirror, declaring his moral superiority.
He acknowledged my little financial contributions, but insisted capital meant nothing compared to physical presence.
"I'm the son who actually shows up," Kaylin lectured. "I sit with them. I give them my actual time, while you just hit transfer from your fancy high-rise." He delivered the lines like they permanently closed the case. I sat in my swivel chair and let the silence stretch. My mind flashed to the afternoon Thane collapsed. I pictured the girl who broke traffic laws to reach the emergency room, while the son was nowhere to be found. I thought about the woman who cross-referenced beta blockers and blood thinners, but I swallowed the words. Kaylin had already written his fantasy script, and you cannot audit the reality of a person refusing to open their eyes. I offered a single, quiet proposition. "Since capital means nothing, Kaylin, I assume you're ready to absorb the monthly equity payments on the acreage you're inheriting." The cellular line went completely dead for 5 seconds. Then he chuckled, a dismissive, patronizing sound, treating my ultimatum like a childish tantrum. He told me to call back when my hysterics wore off, and hung up. I hadn't elevated my volume a single decibel. Lyrene, however, attacked the situation from an entirely different flank. That is how I discovered my future sister-in-law was the true architect of this delusion. Months prior, long before the trust betrayal surfaced, she had invited me to a collaborative digital mood board.
It was one of those glossy renovation apps where people hoard concepts they cannot afford. At the time, I brushed it off as an olive branch, or perhaps a subtle hint that I would be expected to finance whatever aesthetic she desired. She never revoked my access, meaning my phone still buzzed whenever she saved a new concept. The project folder was titled The Legacy Estate. I tapped the notification before logic could stop me. 62 saved documents. It wasn't just paint swatches. She had uploaded complete architectural floor plans, mapped out fresh electrical wiring grids for the ground floor, and pinned luxury material selections, imported marble, brushed brass fixtures, and a sledgehammer taken to the load-bearing walls separating the kitchen from the formal study. My parents' study. The room sitting squarely on a title deed legally bound to my name. That specific visual shattered the abstraction. It hit me like a bounced check hitting an empty account. They weren't merely waiting for my parents to pass away. They were actively engineering a massive renovation in the present, fully banking on my invisible, endless stream of cash to subsidize it. They expected my money to flow like tap water. If you have ever been the invisible engine powering a family, the workhorse who pays the electric bill but never gets invited to the dinner party, you understand the precise, freezing hollow that opened in my chest. Stay with me. Hit subscribe so we can finish this demolition together, because the entire power dynamic is about to flip, and you deserve a front row seat. I closed the application, but I deliberately remained a collaborator. I needed to monitor exactly what the legacy estate was plotting next. By week 3, Sariel decided to weaponize the community. Small-town gossip networks are lethal. The barrage started with my Aunt Vespera. She rang my office line to aggressively inform me that I was driving nails into my mother's soul. Next, Cousin Kalis, a man who hadn't spoken to me since college, shot over a text demanding to know how I could maliciously abandon a sick old man. I couldn't figure out the exact narrative they were swallowing until Sariel took it to the digital public square. She logged into the county's massive neighborhood forum, a chaotic page boasting 5,000 locals arguing over property lines and missing livestock. She drafted a masterclass in passive-aggressive victimhood, a devastatingly soft paragraph lamenting the cruelty of aging, detailing how a mother bleeds to raise her children, only to discover in her twilight years which ones possess genuine love. She strategically omitted my actual name. She didn't have to state a name. The notification feed erupted,
A tsunami of praying hands emojis and furious declarations that modern children lacked fundamental loyalty flooded my screen. Strangers and distant relatives bombarded my phone all afternoon, desperately checking on my vulnerable parents. Nobody asked how I was doing. Not a single soul. I absorbed every comment with icy calm, holding my breath, analyzing the masterclass in manipulation she had just executed. She had taken a strictly financial boundary and weaponized it into a small-town morality play, casting herself as the tragic martyr and me as the soulless, cash-obsessed villain. I had to respect the sheer audacity of the maneuver. Only my cousin Alara bothered to call and ask for my perspective. She sat on the line and absorbed the full audit. The 8 years of silent funding, the ruthless trust document, the shared folder titled The Legacy Estate. Alara sighed softly. I grabbed a pen to record what she said next. Avon, you aren't the monster here. You simply stopped paying the subscription fee for a role you were already playing perfectly.
The true catalyst for war wasn't the public shaming on social media. It was a spectacular operational error. Late on a Thursday evening, a new notification materialized. Somebody accidentally added my number to a private chat group. It was likely Lyran, clumsily managing her contacts while establishing a war room to coordinate my destruction. The chat was titled The Manor Project. It contained exactly 4 participants: Serial, Thane, Kaylin, and Lyran, and then me. For roughly 90 seconds, completely undetected, I scrolled frantically. I absorbed 42 messages, reading them with the intense focus of an investigator reviewing a confession. Lyran confirmed the luxury contractor could break ground by early May, assuming the capital held steady. Serial reassured the group with sickening confidence that I would inevitably cave. She typed that I always caved, I just required sufficient emotional pressure first. Kaylin drugged a crying laughing emoji, followed by the text, "She'll crack by the holidays. She literally cannot help herself. It's pathetic." Then Thane, the man whose life-saving medications I had personally organized, typed the final, devastating sentence that severed the last thread of daughterhood I held.
Thane wrote, "Once the title transfers to Kaylin, her little tantrum stops being an issue anyway." They had a designated label for me in that digital war room. It wasn't daughter. It was a disposable financial asset. My fingers flew, screenshotting every single exchange. I captured every timestamp, every cruel emoji, because I am a professional auditor, and a woman preparing for a boardroom execution requires pristine receipts. Suddenly, a participant noticed the rogue number. The typing bubbles frantically appeared and vanished. Kaylin silently ejected me from the chat without a single word. But the data was already secured. I held the unalterable proof in my palm. And for the first time in an agonizing decade, I stopped feeling like the broken cog in the machine and started feeling like the engineer holding the detonation switch. That digital error drove me straight to the heavy steel safe in my closet. I hadn't cracked that combination in years. I had never needed to verify what I had signed. But acknowledging a fact and physically examining the documentation are entirely different experiences. That night, I needed visual confirmation.
I extracted the original escrow binder, the massive file I had maintained since I was 26, and laid the contents across my granite island under the stark pendant lights. The lender's promissory note, the final settlement matrix, and the recorded deed. I analyzed the text with surgical precision, exactly how I had audited their cruel trust, but this time, my name wasn't missing. It dominated the header. I wasn't listed as a mere guarantor. I wasn't just a bleeding heart cosigner bailing out her parents. I was registered as a legal owner. That desperate restructuring 8 years prior hadn't just chained me to the massive debt. It had permanently inscribed me on the property title as a tenant in common. Because I had furnished the massive cash injection to halt the foreclosure, I possessed the overriding majority share. The parchment defined the equity split in absolute, undeniable numbers. I collapsed back against my leather chair. Thane's trust promised the entire acreage to Kaylin, but a trust can only bequeath what the deceased actually possesses. The sprawling estate Thane had so casually gifted to the male heir. The very rooms Lyrene was actively measuring for imported marble was legally, tangibly, and overwhelmingly mine. It had been for 8 solid years.
They were actively scheming to hand Kaylin an estate that I legally commanded. They had arrogantly written me out of a legacy that, regarding the physical property, was never entirely theirs to control. I didn't feel a rush of victory. I felt a frigid, calculated clarity. I felt like a forensic accountant who had finally trapped the embezzler. Now I merely had to determine the exact method of execution. I am not arrogant enough to interpret complex property law without backup. People who try that lose their leverage. So I booked an urgent consultation with Valerius Thorne, an aggressive real estate litigator whose corporate books I managed. I dropped the recorded deed, the settlement matrix, and a spreadsheet detailing 8 years of massive payments onto his mahogany desk. Valerius pushed his tortoise-shell glasses up his nose and scanned the documents. He let out a low, impressed hum, the specific sound an attorney makes when the ammunition is flawless. He stated, very cautiously, that he needed to verify the county registry, but based on the raw ink, I was the undisputed majority owner and the sole primary debtor. He explained that Thane's trust could only transfer his pathetic minority fraction to Kaylin. It could not touch mine. Then Valerius delivered the fatal blow. The exact legal leverage I suspected, but needed a licensed professional to validate. Serial and Thane were legally paralyzed. They could not liquidate the estate, they could not secure additional equity lines, and they absolutely could not execute Lyren's structural renovations without my explicit, notarized signature. You cannot take a sledgehammer to a jointly owned asset without unanimous consent. I asked Valerius to lay out my tactical options. He delivered them with zero emotion, just raw legal strategy. Option A, force a brutal partition sale and extract my massive equity share. Option B, offer a predatory buyout for their fraction. Option C, maintain the silent status quo and allow the Manor project architects to slam face first into reality when the permits were denied. I paid his exorbitant retainer on the spot, refusing to be a hypocrite about outstanding invoices. Then I retreated to my high-rise to wait for the inevitable collision. It happened exactly 1 month after I murdered the automatic transfer. 4 agonizing weeks of unreturned voicemails, community gossip, and a luxury contractor holding a May start date. 4 weeks of my absolute silence while legally controlling their entire universe. Then, at 6:12 on a Tuesday, before the sun even crested, Serial launched the text I will carry to my grave. No greetings, no inquiries about my life. Just a sterile, entitled demand, ending with a period sharp as a knife. The transfer is overdue. I stood perfectly still in my custom kitchen, inside the sanctuary I had fully paid for, and stared at the glowing screen. I visualized the 96 transfers. I remembered the trust document, that single clinical sentence declaring I had received sufficient value. I flashed back to that secret chat thread, the one where I had been reduced to a walking bank deposit, where Thane practically salivated over the day my financial usefulness would expire. I finally did the one thing that set this entire demolition into motion. I typed out a reply. No massive paragraphs explaining my trauma. No bulleted list chronicling 3,000 days of payments. I deliberately withheld any mention of the recorded deed, because a weapon that lethal belongs in a crowded room, not a text thread. I drafted a single lethal sentence and hit send.
since Kaylin inherits everything. Kaylin inherits the debt. I flipped my phone over, silencing the screen. I walked to the espresso machine, pulled a fresh shot, and actually finished my coffee while it was still scalding hot. I hadn't experienced that simple luxury in almost a decade. I had never executed a move that quiet, yet it struck with the force of a wrecking ball. Before the porcelain mug was even empty, the device buzzing against the granite countertop sounded like an angry hornet. I let it vibrate. When I finally flipped it back over, I stared at 12 missed calls and a solid wall of frantic notifications.
Sariel had fired off a massive text block, abusing the caps lock, demanding to know how a human soul could be so violently cruel. Kaylin followed up, aggressively reminding me that I was triggering Thane's cardiac arrhythmia and asking if I felt proud of myself. Then came Lyrian. A woman who had never bothered to learn my birthday was suddenly lecturing me about tearing a sacred family apart over a petty grudge. Grudge. That specific noun did a massive amount of heavy lifting that morning. They had miraculously taken my discovery of their brutal trust document and twisted the narrative. In their heads, they were the innocent victims of my sudden, inexplicable coldness. Aunt Vespera choked out a voice note, declaring her profound disappointment in my character. The county forum ignited again. Sariel had published a new, agonizing update, claiming her physical health was deteriorating under the sheer stress of familial betrayal. I absorbed the hysteria with the same flat pulse I used to balance a quarterly tax report. They fundamentally misread my psychology. I wasn't operating out of rage. Rage burns out fast, and they were banking on my anger turning to ash, leaving me vulnerable, apologetic, and back on the auto draft by December. But the anger was gone. I had crossed into a state of absolute, unbreakable certainty.
A hyper-competent woman holding a recorded property deed inside a steel safe is vastly more dangerous than someone throwing a tantrum. I shot Sariel one final text, suggesting we all sit down at the estate to settle things. Then I dialed Valerius and told him to prep the legal files. I was ready to execute the maneuver. That same evening, Thane actually dialed my direct line. The man rarely touched a phone unless he needed me to write a check or fix a shattered appliance. His voice sounded like grinding gravel, and I could hear the blare of a sports broadcast in the background, cranked to maximum volume. The stubborn hallmark of a man losing his hearing but refusing to admit it. He didn't scream. He never operated that way. He completely threw me off by casually asking about the logistics firm, an inquiry he hadn't made since I launched the company. Then he maneuvered to his actual point. He sighed heavily, claiming he couldn't fathom my sudden cruelty. He started a monologue about a man sweating his entire life, just wanting to leave a tangible legacy behind, desperately needing to know his bloodline would anchor his name to the earth. He delivered the speech with utter, unquestioning conviction. For a split second, I actually felt the emotional gravity of it, the archaic agrarian logic, a patriarch who watched his own father pass the acreage to a male heir, assuming the universe was simply wired that way. I let the sympathy wash over me. Then he repeated the line from the dining room, softer this time, which somehow made it vastly more insulting. The land anchors the sun. It's the natural order. The sympathy instantly evaporated. I realized he had zero interest in understanding my pain. He was literally demanding that I continue subsidizing a medieval tradition designed to erase me, and he expected me to feel honored by the privilege. I kept my voice perfectly level and told him I loved him. It was a factual statement. Then I promised I would drive out on Sunday evening. I suggested the core group, Thane, Sariel, Kaylin, Lyrene, and myself, convene at the dining table and resolve this like rational adults.
I could practically hear the relief flood his chest. He grunted his approval, muttered about me finally showing some sense, and hung up. He was absolutely convinced he had won. He genuinely believed I was driving 40 miles to beg for forgiveness.
I let him hold on to that delusion. Certain confrontations require a heavy mahogany table, a captive audience, and a leather folder that stays firmly closed until the exact right second. The scheduling moved with a terrifying velocity my family normally reserved for emergencies. Serial locked in Sunday at 5 o'clock. By Saturday morning, Alara called with critical intelligence. The summit wasn't going to be an intimate family discussion. Serial had secretly recruited a crowd. Aunt Vespera and her husband were attending. 2 older cousins were driving in. They even invited the Montgomerys, a neighboring couple who had gossiped with my parents for 3 decades. Serial labeled them emotional support, but Alara and I knew the truth. It was a firing squad. The psychological warfare was brilliant. They intended to corner me in a packed room and deploy the only tactic that had historically broken me: public pressure. I have always loathed public spectacles. I avoid drawing attention the way a stray cat avoids a thunderstorm. They were banking on my social anxiety. They calculated that, trapped by judging relatives, with Serial fake weeping and Thane clutching his chest, I would instantly fold, apologize to the room, and reactivate the bank transfers just to escape the sheer humiliation. It was a flawless strategy. They had modeled for every version of me, except the woman I had become. The sick twist? I desperately wanted an audience too. I just planned to present a different set of documents to the exact same jury.
Alara texted me, asking if I was holding up okay. I typed back, instructing her to arrive on Sunday, grab a seat near the back of the dining room, and ensure her phone battery was at 100%. She replied with a question mark, asking why. I told her she would want a permanent record of this execution, and the neighborhood forum was going to require a massive factual correction. I spent my Saturday evening mirroring the exact night I discovered the trust document, sitting at my kitchen island under the stark pendant lights, organizing my data. But I wasn't mourning this time. I was weaponizing. I generated triplicate copies of the absolute truth, the recorded deed with my legal name and majority ownership percentage violently highlighted in neon yellow, the original settlement matrix from the catastrophic loan, 8 years of automated routing receipts stacked in a flawless column, culminating in a final 6-figure sum that made even my logistician brain short-circuit. Valerius's official mandate on heavy watermarked firm stationery, confirming in bulletproof legalese that I was the undisputed majority owner and the estate could absolutely not be liquidated, leveraged, or structurally altered without my explicit notarized signature. I slipped each dossier into a heavy manila envelope, identical to the one that had held my disinheritance. I want to pause here and speak to you exactly how I would speak to a friend across a table. If you are still listening to this recording, thank you. I know how agonizing this stage is, being publicly crucified as the sociopathic villain, when you are literally the only human being keeping the roof over their heads. Hit subscribe and stay for the main course. I swear to you, the power dynamic is about to shatter, and you have earned the absolute right to watch it happen. I didn't write a dramatic monologue. Amateurs who bring emotional speeches to legal executions always lose, because a speech can be shouted down, but a recorded deed cannot be unread. I simply slid the envelopes into my leather briefcase, laid out my charcoal blazer, and slept. I slept deeper than I had in a solid month. The designated savior was officially retired. Sunday morning, just before I grabbed my keys, the Manor Project chat pinged with the final nail I needed. Lyron, completely oblivious that I was still silently monitoring the board, uploaded a new asset. It was a formal contractor's estimate, pinned to the very top.
The total was $55,000. It included the demolition of the load-bearing wall in the study, the installation of the luxury marble, and the farmhouse sink.
A handwritten caption sat below the screenshot. Massive deposit required at signing. Kaylin confirmed Serial can wire it from the emergency fund. From the emergency fund? The exact account I had personally replenished for 8 years. The exact account legally designated in the trust as Kaylin's exclusive inheritance. They were plotting to drain my parents' cash I had subsidized, to demolish a house that I legally controlled, framing it as a renovation gift for my brother, all while publicly executing me in the town square for bleeding the family dry. I silently screenshotted the contractor's bid and slid the printout into my master envelope. I wasn't angry. Anger was a useless emotion I abandoned weeks ago. Instead, I felt the final, lingering drop of guilt completely evaporate. That pathetic, conditioned inner voice that had been whispering, "Maybe you are being too harsh. Just reactivate the transfer and keep the peace." That voice died permanently at $55,000. A profound, icy clarity settles into your bones when people document exactly how expendable they consider you. They had handed me their utter disrespect in a glossy renovation app, casually plotting to rip out a structural wall they literally had no legal authority to touch. They just hadn't realized it yet. I grabbed my blazer. It was time to drive to the acreage. The commute to the estate is exactly 40 miles, and I know every pothole on that asphalt. I drove it that Sunday afternoon, with the leather briefcase strapped into the passenger seat and the stereo completely dead. I wasn't practicing what I would say. I had stopped rehearsing the night I decoded their trust document. Instead, I analyzed the 26-year-old girl who had grabbed that pen at the dining table, signing her life away because the only alternative was watching her parents become homeless. I didn't hate her. She had operated honorably with the data she possessed. The fatal error wasn't providing the signature. The catastrophic error was spending a decade believing that love was a transactional debt, and that family peace was purchased by remaining silent about your own equity. I drove past the rusted gas station where Thane bought his scratch-offs. I passed the community center where Serial posted her slander. I passed the exit for Kaylin's old rental, the one I had bailed out twice. The landscape was muted and gray, a typical Oak Haven afternoon that offered zero theatrics. I felt a profound, chilling calm I hadn't experienced in years. Not emotional numbness, pure logistical calm. The exact sensation when the final ledger balances perfectly to zero. I wasn't going to win this war by screaming over them. My bloodline had mastered the art of volume. I was going to obliterate them by being factually correct on legal parchment, in front of an audience, and by remaining so terrifyingly quiet that my silence consumed the entire room. I crunched onto the gravel driveway at precisely 4:58 p.m. 6 vehicles were already parked in formation. The air inside the house was thick with the scent of roasted lamb, because Serial firmly believed a heavy meal could manipulate any negotiation. For 3 decades, she had mostly been correct. The mahogany table was extended to its absolute maximum, covered in the formal lace cloth. Aunt Vespera sat rigid, arms crossed defensively. The Montgomerys wore their solemn, judgmental Sunday faces. Ilara was positioned near the far wall exactly as instructed, her phone resting discreetly in her lap.
Thane occupied the head chair, looking older than I remembered, his hand resting theatrically over his pacemaker out of fresh habit. Serial already had a crumpled tissue clutched in her fist before I even crossed the threshold. Kaylin and Lorraine anchored the long side of the table, and Lorraine radiated the smug glow of a woman who fully believed her imported marble was secured. They had staged the room for a groveling apology. Every single set of eyes was fixed on me, waiting for the surrender. I gently placed my briefcase by the chair, removed my blazer, and rested my hands flat on the lace. I hadn't brought an apology. I had brought the dossiers. Serial launched the offensive because she always initiated the attack. She didn't even wait for me to pull out my chair.
she triggered a meticulously rehearsed monologue about parasitic children discarding the elderly, her voice violently cracking at the exact moment she uttered the word abandoned. Aunt Vespera actually whispered shameful under her breath like a religious chant. Thane stared intently at his empty plate. Then Kalen tagged in, because they operated like a tag team wrestling duo. He physically stood up, actually stood up to dominate the space, and declared it was time I understood how psychotic I looked to the real world.
He accused me of intentionally starving a sick old man to hoard my corporate wealth. He claimed I was torturing the parents over a trust document that was none of my damn business. And then he delivered the kill shot they had all assembled to witness. He scanned the audience of relatives and neighbors, dropped his voice an octave to sound deeply grave, and demanded, "So, Avon, are you seriously prepared to throw your own flesh and blood onto the pavement over a petty financial grudge?" The entire dining room froze, staring at me. This was the engineered climax. This was the exact second the reliable workhorse was supposed to crack, burst into tears, beg for forgiveness, and yank out her phone to reactivate the routing numbers just to stop the suffocating shame. I felt the collective pressure of the room lean into me. I did not elevate my volume. I didn't even move my hands. I let his disgusting question hang in the dead air for a long, agonizing moment, forcing everyone to digest the sheer manipulation of it. Then I spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. I stated that nobody was throwing anyone onto the pavement. I clarified I had never once issued that threat, and I calmly asked Kalen to inform the jury who had actually introduced that violent imagery. He stuttered, completely unable to answer, because he was the one who had fabricated the quote. The first microscopic fracture appeared in their flawless execution, and only I could see the foundation cracking. Then I casually reached into the leather briefcase. The entire assembly tracked my hands, like a jury watching a murder weapon being unveiled. I extracted the 3 heavy dossiers. I smoothly slid the first across the lace to Aunt Vespera, passed the second to the Montgomerys, and deliberately placed the final envelope dead center in front of Thane. I kept my tone soft, almost surgical. I told the room I had brought some verified documentation, since this family suddenly valued equity and justice requires factual evidence. Speaking precisely the way I would brief a junior accountant, I explained that 8 years prior, when the financial employed seniors facing foreclosure, I had personally restructured the massive debt in my own name to save the acreage. I confirmed I had been the sole guarantor ever since, and the monthly equity transfer everyone was suddenly sobbing over had drained directly from my corporate accounts exactly 96 times. I instructed the stunned room to open the dossiers. I told them to locate the tab marked Recorded Title. I told them I demanded a corporate litigator verify every single syllable. And then I articulated exactly what Valerius had highlighted in neon ink. My signature anchored the title. Not as a generous helper, not as a bleeding heart cosigner doing her parents a favor. I stood as the undisputed majority stakeholder and had maintained that position for nearly a decade. I explained property law to the dining room in a dead flat tone. A trust can only distribute what a dead man actually owns. Therefore, Thane was free to bequeath his pathetic fractional share to Kalen, but he absolutely could not gift Kalen my equity. The massive estate they were actively scheming to remodel, inherit, and pass down the bloodline was, according to the county registry, already mine. I didn't inject cruelty into my delivery. The raw data didn't require venom. I just let the recorded documents do the talking. And the dining room descended into a suffocating, terrifying quiet. The type of quiet that precedes a structural collapse. The silence shattered exactly how I predicted. It didn't come from me. Kalen erupted first.
He violently shoved his heavy oak chair backward, screaming that the paperwork was a malicious forgery. He yelled that I had aggressively manipulated a sick old man into signing a trap, insisting no judge would ever believe a daughter possessed her parents' home. I didn't interrupt him. When a narcissist is losing a war, they usually do the destructive work for you, if you just sit perfectly still.
Lorraine's complexion shifted through 3 distinct shades of panic before settling on a chalky, sickly white. She sat paralyzed, watching her imported marble countertops and farmhouse sink vanish down a legal drain she couldn't comprehend. Serial unleashed the waterworks at maximum volume, wailing that I had maliciously tricked them, that I was weaponizing their vulnerability after everything they had sacrificed for me. Aunt Vespera, to her immense credit, had completely abandoned her religious chanting and was actually reading the highlighted settlement matrix. Silas Montgomery, the retired insurance adjuster they brought for emotional support, looked up from the recorded deed. He adjusted his spectacles and whispered, "Serial, this carries the county seal. It's absolutely real." That single, soft validation decimated my mother faster than any argument I could have constructed, because it came directly from her own hand-picked witness. Through the entire chaotic spectacle, Thane never uttered a single syllable. He had peeled open his manila envelope. He stared at the Gothic font of the deed, staring at his name sitting directly beneath mine. His hand slowly slipped away from his pacemaker and fell flat against the lace tablecloth. His face underwent a horrific transformation. The arrogant certainty evaporated, replaced by raw, unadulterated terror. He had constructed his entire masculine identity on a single archaic phrase, "The land anchors the sun," and he was staring at a piece of parchment that had silently annihilated that phrase 8 years ago while he was looking the other way. He slowly lifted his eyes to meet mine. For a fraction of a second, the medieval tradition vanished from his gaze. There was no legacy, no sacred male heir, just a fragile old man with a surgical stent who had arrogantly gambled his daughter's financial loyalty and lost everything. I almost felt a flicker of pity for him. Almost. When the room finally exhausted its oxygen and the screaming faded into ragged breathing, I spoke again. My volume remained locked at a whisper. I stated clearly that I hadn't driven 40 miles to render anyone homeless. I was there because the objective truth had been locked in a steel safe for an entire decade, and it was time it pulled up a chair at their mahogany table. Then, I extended an olive branch, because I do not operate on petty revenge. I operate on balanced ledgers. I declared my era as the invisible auto draft was permanently terminated, but I offered them 3 concrete exit strategies, the exact options Valerius had outlined. Option A, they remain residing in the house, but we execute a brutal, legally binding contract defining exactly who owns what, splitting the property taxes and maintenance costs proportionally in ink. Option B, I execute a predatory buyout. They take a lump sum for their minority fraction, vacate the premises, and live out their retirement wherever they want without a massive debt hanging over their heads.
I locked eyes directly with my brother as I delivered it. If Thane's finalized trust genuinely bequeaths the entire kingdom to Kaelin, then Kaelin, the undisputed heir to the legacy, can personally absorb the monthly equity payments starting on the 1st of next month. The choice belonged entirely to them, but my legal team would require their decision in writing. Serial, her face heavily streaked with mascara, choked out that I was treating my own sacred bloodline like a sterile business transaction. This was the exact moment I gently handed her own weapon back to her, having carried the wound for a solid month. "You told me real families don't keep tallies," I replied softly. "You were absolutely correct. For 8 agonizing years, I never kept a scorecard. I just blindly signed the checks. But the financial institutions keep ledgers, Serial, and my signature is the only one they recognize." I let the brutal reality of that statement suffocate the room. Then I pushed my chair back and stood up. I was done. And finishing a war feels profoundly different than screaming in one. Nobody attempted to physically stop me. That is the detail that will haunt me forever. Not the initial explosion of rage, but the crushing, defeated silence that followed when they ran out of ammunition. Serial's crumpled tissue remained paralyzed in her fist. Tears are only effective weapons against someone who still fears them.
Kalen collapsed back into his heavy oak chair, staring blankly at his china plate, exactly how he looked the night he falsely believed he had inherited the earth. Lorraine was already frantically swiping at her phone screen. I highly suspect the Manor project folder was being permanently deleted at that exact second. Thane refused to look up from the lace tablecloth. I slipped into my charcoal blazer. I dropped a notarized copy of Valeria's legal mandate directly next to the cooling roasted lamb and advised them to notify me which option they preferred. Then I navigated the 40 miles back to my high-rise. I gripped the leather steering wheel, the dashboard dark, the stereo dead. For the first time in an entire decade, the silence inside my sedan wasn't something I had to brace myself against. It was simply quiet. It belonged entirely to me. It took them 3 agonizing weeks to select an option, which was basically the speed of light for my bloodline. They ultimately surrendered to option A. Serial physically could not stomach abandoning her social status in the neighborhood, and Thane's ego could not survive admitting option B even existed. Valerius drafted a ruthless, ironclad agreement. It translated the exact ownership percentages into raw numbers that even Serial couldn't manipulate with her tears. It legally forced them to cover their proportional share of the maintenance and levies, bearing the signatures of everyone listed on the county deed.
Kalen violently refused to contribute a single cent. He labeled the entire legal contract a massive betrayal and abandoned his rental within 28 days. The terrifying prospect of actually financing the luxury estate he planned to steal eradicated his interest in the property immediately. Lyrene's glossy mood board vanished into the digital void, and her luxury renovation died in the contractor's spam folder. Aunt Vespera, who had scrutinized every highlighted paragraph at that dining table, began quietly informing the neighborhood gossips that they had completely botched the narrative. Ilara, holding the fully charged phone near the back wall, dropped one devastatingly calm, factual correction onto the county forum. Zero malice, just the chronological receipts. Serial's tragic martyr saga instantly stopped farming sympathy emojis. The baked casseroles stopped arriving. The community slander was finally audited against the actual data, and the data won. I still visit the acreage. People always look shocked when I admit that. Thane's failing heart is basically a part-time job now, and I still archive his medical files because my core nature hasn't changed. I've made my peace with my hypercompetence, but the dynamic is entirely different now, and that difference is everything. I drive out there because I actively choose to, not because an invoice demands my presence. We discuss his sodium levels and the incoming weather fronts. We absolutely never discuss capital, because the capital is locked inside a binding corporate contract where it belongs, rather than poisoning every family dinner.
Serial and I navigate each other with extreme caution now. We act like two people handling a shattered vase that was hastily glued back together. The relationship is unrecognizable from what it used to be, and I genuinely prefer it this way. Kalen and I maintain absolute radio silence. I stopped waiting for that estrangement to feel like an open wound months ago. Certain ledgers are permanently closed on purpose, and the final remaining balance is just pure peace. I finally sleep through the night. The automated banking transfers remain permanently severed, and on the first morning of every month, when my cellular device used to vibrate with a catastrophic crisis that somehow always demanded my wallet, there is nothing but dawn, hot espresso, and the profound quiet I finally stopped subsidizing. I learned a brutal lesson. Love that exclusively flows in one direction isn't actual love. It's a predatory invoice that nobody else ever intends to pay. And you possess the absolute right, at any age, in front of any hostile audience, to stop signing your name to it. That is my reality. A decade of labor, 96 massive capital transfers,
and one recorded title deed they arrogantly assumed was a myth. If this broadcast reminded you to aggressively audit the paperwork bearing your signature, or to stop financing a seat at a table that actively schemes to replace you, consider this your warning klaxon. Execute it today. Share this audio with someone drowning in obligation. Drop your city in the comments, hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next case file.